Our last class raised a set of puzzling questions about the European colonization of America. The central question was, why Europe? Why was Europe, and especially England, chosen by divinity to direct the development of the Americas? We discovered that this was an unlikely choice in the decades before Columbus, for Europe was then a backward periphery on the fringe of the civilized world. In the 15th century, the great powers were China and the Islamic empires, such as the Ottoman Turks, each more wealthy, more powerful, more sophisticated, and more technically advanced than any of the small, squabbling principalities of Europe. A historian observed, judging from the rare and rather disdainful references in Muslim writings, Western Europe must have appeared to them rather as Central Asia or Africa appeared to Victorian Englishmen, a remote and unexplored wilderness inhabited by exotic and picturesque tribes with dirty and nasty habits. And yet, Europe was chosen with enormous consequences. The European discovery of America is generally recognized as a turning point in the entire history of the world, an event that signaled the birth of the modern age around the year 1500. Historians have long associated this modern age with the rise of the West, noting that before 1500, the world had pressed in on Europe. After 1500, Europe pressed out into the world. By 1800, European explorers had charted every inhabited coastline on Earth, fashioning a truly worldwide web of trade and interchange among all the continents, and creating also a new global balance, dominated everywhere by European ideals and values. If we adopt the perspective of spiritual history, we can understand the European discovery of America in a much broader context, as an important step toward the eventual unification of humanity in Meher Baba's New World culture. Though few, if any, of the players in the unfolding drama of decades and centuries would have had any awareness of the ultimate direction and purpose of their activities. Knowing the goal, as we do, we can discern in these events what Sri Aurobindo called the secret working of nature, a slow, evolving experiment to bring together streams of life that had developed separately in different lands and even on different continents over many thousands of years. As these continental energies first influenced and then merged with one another, they nurtured new forms of social organization, new inventions, and new understandings of the world that completely transformed Europe, and then the rest of the globe. It is this large-scale, divine project of connecting the energies of the continents that gave rise to the European age of exploration and all that followed, including the United States. This perspective differs from that of many traditional scholars whose focus has been on charting the struggles for dominance among what they see as competing cultures, political or economic systems, who's up, who's down. Instead, we can understand the separate dramas and achievements of history as contributions toward a larger, wider framework of total human growth and integration. Every civilization, nation, tribe, clan, or family, every social, political, or religious movement is a living form. It embodies a truth, some aspect of divinity seeking expression. Thus, Aurobindo could write of the inner life of a race or an empire and the psychological truth of a nation. Each such group that coalesces into manifestation must explore fully its own identity, that is, the dimensions, possibilities, and limits of its own life, and then find ways to add its learning to the whole. This is a divine experiment in social evolution on a grand scale. This actually follows patterns similar to the geologic evolution of continents or the development of biological forms. As the purpose of biological evolution is to achieve human consciousness, so the purpose of social evolution might be to achieve human unity. Some contributions to this goal are easily integrated, others are not. Often the process appears to fail, to halt, or even reverse temporarily as the experiment is reorganized on a different foundation. Nothing is guaranteed except the eventual goal, the new humanity. To set the European colonization of America into this broader framework, we must review 3 such contributions that helped make it possible. 2 of the contributors, China and the Islamic empires, we'll consider in a few moments. The first and most important contributor is a person. You've probably guessed who it is. Let me give you some background before I confirm your guess. We all know that the New World was discovered by apparent accident. The primary motivation of the early European explorers was trade. They were seeking a more economical route to the wealth of the East. Why were they so determined? Clearly, there were great rewards, and personal profit was only one of them. Many historians consider the growth of trade and commerce to be the single most important factor in the development of the modern world. In this view, increased trade stimulates all other dimensions of culture, serving in many ways as an engine of progress. Whether or not it is the single most important factor, international trade has clearly continued to grow, reaching an acme of its development in our times and showing every sign that it will continue to exceed itself as an engine of material progress. Today, modern corporations whose wealth and power are founded on long-distance commerce are larger and more powerful than many nations. A survey of the world's 100 largest revenue producers in 2003 showed that only 24 were governments. The other 76 were corporations. Our present era of globalization is no doubt the most mercantile age the world has ever seen. In recent years, encouraging trends have pointed to an evolution of these commercial organizations beyond the lower motivational patterns of gain, greed, and glory that may originally have built them. Today, during natural disasters, we've seen corporations act more quickly and more effectively than public agencies to bring emergency relief to stricken areas where they do business, helping not only their own employees and customers, but surrounding communities as well. We have also begun to see stirring examples of philanthropy, where programs to help the poor and the sick have been invigorated by enormous private foundations endowed by wealthy individual donors whose resources outstrip those of the government. Of course, the practice of philanthropy is not new in America. In fact, it is very American. Given a philosophical basis in Andrew Carnegie's Gospel of Wealth, philanthropy and organized giving have always thrived here, as the energy bathing this landmass especially inclines Americans toward generosity of spirit. To name just two familiar examples, in the 19th century, the Carnegie Foundation built thousands of public libraries. In the 20th, the Rockefeller Foundation helped control yellow fever and also sponsored the Green Revolution that dramatically increased food production around the world. Today's philanthropists are much younger. They come from computer-related industries. They begin giving much earlier in their career and fund worthy projects abroad as readily as at home. And there are more of them. According to The Economist magazine, the number of billionaires in America has more than doubled since 1997. And at the current pace of growth, 11 new foundations and 119 new nonprofit groups are created every day. Global commerce has made possible an astonishing explosion of material progress around the world and is ultimately becoming a force for the equalization of wealth and material resources across the globe. Some say it began with the discovery of the New World by Columbus, and that we have never looked back. However, we would place the initial impetus for this unprecedented expansion of international commerce much further back, to the 7th century and to the work of another avatar, Muhammad. In an earlier class, we discussed how Muhammad laid the groundwork for modern democracy through the community he established at Medina. We noted that Muhammad's patterns of life demonstrated and anchored broad themes of human development that were to unfold in many ways throughout the world over the course of his manifestation. In the case of Muhammad, you may recall that he did not begin his mission as the prophet until he was in his 40s. Before that, do you remember how he earned his livelihood? He was an orphan. His father died before he was born, and his mother died when Muhammad was about 6 years old. He was raised by his uncle, Abu Talib, who was a merchant and taught him the trade. We're told that Abu Talib took him along on at least one business trip to Syria. That is a distance of over 1,000 miles through the desert. The round trip by caravan could have lasted half a year. That's quite an adventure for a 10-year-old boy. And the experience made a deep impression on him. Inayat Khan tells the story this way. As a young man, Muhammad traveled with his uncle to Syria on a business trip, and he learned the shortcomings of human nature, which have great scope in the world of business. He found out what profit means and what loss means, and what both mean in the end. It gave him a wider outlook on life, and when he saw how eager people are to profit by the loss of others, and that human beings behave no better in this world than the large and small fishes in the water who prey upon one another. His sincerity in friendship and the honesty of all his dealings endeared him to all, both far and near, who called him by the name of El Amin, which means trusty or trustworthy. Throughout his teens, Muhammad became known for his integrity and fairness in all situations. In his early 20s, he was commissioned by a wealthy widow, Khadija, to take a caravan of goods from Mecca to Syria for her. His engaging personality and straightforward honesty helped him get an especially good return for the merchandise, and this led to closer association with Khadija, who became his wife, the mother of his children, his closest friend, and his first disciple. As Khadija's husband and business manager, Muhammad lived the life of a successful merchant and trader for at least 15 years. Several accounts indicate that he went to the great trade fairs in Yemen and Oman, where he would have met merchants from as far away as China and India. He would have gained a sophisticated understanding of the spice trade and the famous Silk Road through Central Asia. He did not receive the first revelation of the Quran until he was 40, and only then did he begin to shift gradually from the role of merchant to the role of divine messenger. As his avataric mission unfolded, Muhammad applied the principles of fair dealing he had practiced in the marketplace to the negotiation of complex treaties and agreements with contending tribes and factions. Noting that the Quran is filled with parables using the language of trade, one contemporary Muslim scholar even declares, Islam is the only major world religion founded by a businessman. How this translates into Muslim practice was described in a recent Newsweek article. According to this article, Judeo-Christian scripture offers little economic instruction. The book of Deuteronomy, for example, is loaded with edicts on how the faithful should pray, eat, bequeath, keep the holy festivals, and treat slaves and spouses. But it is silent on trade and commerce. In Matthew, when Christ admonishes his followers to give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, he is effectively conceding fiscal and monetary authority to pagan Rome. Islam is different. The Prophet Muhammad, himself a trader, preached merchant honor, the only regulation that the borderless Levantine market knew. In Muslim liturgy, the deals cut in the souk, or the bazaar, became a metaphor for the contract between God and the faithful. And the business model Muhammad prescribed, according to Muslim scholars and economists, is very much in the laissez-faire tradition later embraced by the West. Prices were to be set by God alone, anticipating by more than a millennium Adam Smith's reference to the invisible hand of market-based pricing. Merchants were not to cut deals outside the souk, an early attempt to thwart insider trading. In the days of the Caliphate, Islam developed the most sophisticated monetary system the world had yet known. Muhammad had chosen the place of his advent strategically. Arabia lies at the crossroads of 3 continents, at the hub of ancient trade routes linking Europe, Asia, and Africa over land and sea. Islam was to spread as much through peaceful trade as through military conquest. First, along the caravan routes that linked different regions of Arabia to the pilgrimage center of Mecca. Then through Asia, where trade networks such as the Silk Road had long existed, and south to sub-Saharan Africa. And Arab vessels, with their distinctive triangular lateen sails, would carry the message of Islam along with their cargo across the Mediterranean, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, and the Indian Ocean. Under the impetus of Muhammad, trade flourished and expanded very quickly in this region. Caravans and merchant communities were respected, protected, and even subsidized throughout the Muslim world. Though there was a great cultural diversity within the House of Islam, the Dar al-Islam, as it was called, there was the unity of a shared language, Arabic, and a shared code of ethics and conduct, Islam, that helped strengthen the bonds of trade. From the Atlantic coast of Iberia to the South China Sea, traders could move freely and confidently about their business. This led to a literally fruitful interchange of agricultural crops across the continents. Rice, cotton, sugarcane, citrus fruits, and coconut palms found their way to the Middle East, North Africa, and even Spain for the first time. The new agricultural diversity stimulated population growth, which supported increased productivity and urbanization. Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba in Spain grew to become the world's largest cities during Islam's golden age. As the cities flourished, so did the artisans and craftsmen, producing silks, brocades, fine leather, and metalwork, all of which led to still more trade and still more wealth, not just for Islam, but for its trading partners on 3 continents. All a stunning example of trade as an engine of progress. This unfoldment of life for the entire avataric cycle was confirmed during Muhammad's advent on earth. He brought this about through the life he led. He strengthened the positive qualities of character that were naturally present in the Arab trading culture of his birth. He became the divine merchant. But the archetype established by Muhammad's life was to generalize widely. Though the Arab character and associated Muslim practices supported and greatly amplified this upsurge of long-distance trade, it was not just an Arab or Islamic phenomenon. As part of the Avatar's work, commerce and trade networks also spread around the world, uniting the length of China from north to south, linking the Pacific coast of North America and the southern tip of Mexico, and encompassing the entire Atlantic coast of Europe from Norway to Africa in the west and in the east, the rivers of Russia, all the way to Constantinople. These were not Muslim cultures, nor were the European explorers and trading empires that came later. Yet their activities had been set in motion by the avataric work of Muhammad. Just as he had kindled the spark of democracy and brotherhood that would catch fire in other lands and other centuries, so did the Avatar Muhammad touch the chords of commerce, and the entire world still vibrates to the rhythms of long-distance trade. By 1451, when Columbus was born, nearly 3/4 of humanity had been connected in some way by trade networks, from the Atlantic on the west to the Russian force in the north, to Japan in the east, to the Indian Ocean and the coast of Africa in the south. This vast territory was crisscrossed by thousands of caravan routes and sea lanes, with the capacity to carry not just Chinese porcelain to East Africa or Spanish silver to the Spice Islands, but also to spread new technologies and new ideas everywhere. Everywhere but the New World, which was separated from these networks by thousands of miles of ocean on either side. We know that Europe was destined to forge that link. But how could the Europeans develop the abilities and tools they would need to cross the great Atlantic, which even the adventurous Arab sailors had fearfully named the Green Sea of Darkness? It is not easy for us to appreciate the magnitude and difficulty of the early voyages of exploration. Today, any of us can cross the Atlantic in a few hours in comfort with a meal and a movie. It took Columbus more than 2 months to make the crossing over uncharted, dangerous, storm-tossed waters with no assurance that he would ever find land, let alone find his way back home. One historian characterized the problems involved. The Atlantic Ocean was an almost insurmountable obstacle, even to the most daring seafarer. The medieval adventurer faced the green sea of darkness with no means of navigation once he'd lost sight of land. And he sailed in frail vessels that could make no headway against a contrary wind. Even when sailors and navigators had the necessary skills and the ships capable of taking them into the vastness of the North and South Atlantic, they required stout hearts to face the elements in vessels that were scarcely larger than small trawlers, to exist on a diet of salt beef, beans, biscuits, stale water, and an occasional ration of wine, and to endure months at sea with no sleeping accommodation except the bare deck. Even in the 16th century, when ships were stronger and wind and weather conditions better understood, the mortality rate was enough to discourage the most determined adventurer. Magellan started out in 1519 to circumnavigate the globe with 5 ships and 275 men. Only 18 of his original crew completed the voyage 3 years later. One civilization had solved nearly all these problems long before Columbus. That culture was China. The Chinese had been building ocean-going ships for hundreds of years. They pioneered many aspects of ship design and navigation that were unknown to Europeans until the Middle Ages and even later. The Chinese junk, which had sailed the China Sea since at least 100 AD, was a far more effective design than any European ship before 1450. Using bamboo inserts called battens, the sails could be easily reefed, that is, rolled up or adjusted to change their size to accommodate the force of the wind. The sails could also be pivoted to catch the wind from different directions, unlike the inflexible, square-rigged European style. Other important design innovations included the stern rudder for steering, lee boards to reduce drift and increase stability, and even watertight compartments in the hold. Most of these innovations were in place by the 2nd century AD. By 1400, these ships had grown to enormous proportions and were making regular intercontinental voyages. the like of which the world had never seen. In the early 1400s, an armada of nearly 300 ships made up what was called the treasure fleet, the largest fleet assembled for a single voyage until the 20th century. The treasure ships were colossal, 1,500-ton, 9-masted vessels, 440 feet long and 160 feet wide. That would be the length of 1.5 football fields, nearly 6 times the size of the ships Columbus used. Each of these grand vessels carried a crew of 1,000 men. They were accompanied by a complement of somewhat smaller supply ships, troop transports, warships, patrol boats, and water tankers. A single expedition carried 28,000 soldiers, sailors, craftsmen, merchants, and scientists from eastern China to Malaysia, to India, to the Persian Gulf, even as far as Zanzibar and back, a journey of 10,000 miles. In contrast, Columbus, decades later, struggled to make a 3,000-mile Atlantic crossing with 3 tiny ships and a crew of 90. And he returned with only 2 ships, since his flagship, the Santa Maria, was wrecked off the coast of Haiti. How were the Chinese able to come up with all of these innovations? And if they were so far ahead of Europe for so many centuries, why aren't we speaking Chinese today? The answers are surprising. Did you know that China has been known as the world's workshop, at least since the days of the Roman Empire? Over the millennia, this unique and ancient culture has served as a cradle of scientific discovery and technological advance, the source of many of the most important inventions on which modern culture is founded. The practical, pragmatic Chinese seem to have always had a genius for bringing an idea into concrete, material form. For example, as early as 500 BC, the Chinese had mastered the technique of the blast furnace that allowed them to make cast iron tools and weapons. With that technology, they developed the wheelbarrow and the moldboard plow. That is the kind of iron plow that lifts up and turns the sod, breaking up the soil for planting, and revolutionized the practice of agriculture. By 200 BC, their metalworking techniques had reached a scale and sophistication unmatched in Europe until the late 18th century and the Industrial Revolution. The same knowledge of high-temperature firing allowed them to develop porcelain, which the West was unable to duplicate until the 1700s. The ancient cultivation of the silkworm led the Chinese to develop advanced machines for weaving and textile manufacture by the 2nd century BC that were not seen in Europe until the Middle Ages. Most important of all were what the Chinese themselves called the four great inventions. The first was paper. The second great invention was printing. The third was gunpowder, and the fourth was the magnetic compass. Around 1600, on the threshold of the European Enlightenment, the English philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon acknowledged their key role in the remarkable transformation of material culture in the preceding century. Bacon wrote, "Printing, gunpowder, and the compass have changed the whole face and stage of things throughout the world. The first in literature, the second in warfare, the third in navigation, whence have followed innumerable changes. Insomuch that no empire, no sect, no star seems to have exerted greater power and influence in human affairs than these mechanical discoveries." Bacon understood the great importance of these inventions, but he had no idea that all of them had come from China. When they found their way to Europe, each of the four great inventions contributed to the discovery of America. How are they linked to America? Gunpowder created a military revolution which accelerated the political and social transformation of Europe from feudal principalities to powerful nations capable of underwriting journeys of exploration to the New World and eager to beat their rivals to it. We will learn more about these expeditions sent out from such young nation-states as Spain, Portugal, and France in future classes. The introduction of paper and printing to Europe led to the wide circulation of information about other lands, such as Marco Polo's famous account of his travels in China, a book that directly inspired Columbus' voyage to find a trade route to the east. The printing press also helped stimulate the development of cartography, for now the newest maps and nautical charts, once copied slowly by hand at great cost, could be mass-produced and easily obtained by explorers and seafarers. And the compass, of course, would prove essential for accurate navigation in the vast and forbidding unknown of the Atlantic, the green sea of darkness. Though the Chinese had developed all these technological inventions, they did not use them the way the Europeans did. The great Chinese treasure fleet, with its dozens of ships and tens of thousands of men, made 7 voyages between 1405 and 1433, in the most prosperous phase of the Ming dynasty. They apparently had no interest in conquest or territorial expansion, only in exploration. We know they reached southern Africa since they brought back exotic animals, including a giraffe, for the emperor's pleasure. Some scholars believe they may have gone on into the Atlantic to reach North America. However, if they did make such a voyage, they left no record of it. In fact, after 1433, when the admiral who had directed the fleet for nearly 30 years died, the long voyages were abruptly abandoned. The emperor who had supported the explorations had passed away a few years before. The new emperor redirected the energies of China away from the sea. Instead, he turned his attention north, strengthened the famous Great Wall, and extended it to secure the northern border against a renewed threat from the Mongols. Then, as a new faction prevailed at court, the Ming rulers and their successors turned their backs on the outside world. They determined that they had no need for any resources outside their own kingdom. The great ships were scuttled. Records of the voyages were destroyed, and the new emperor decreed that no ship could be built with more than 2 masts. By 1470, the skills needed to build such vessels had been lost. From then on, those who wished to trade with China came to China. Scholars are puzzled and divided about the reasons for this abrupt reversal, though most acknowledge that both self-sufficiency and xenophobia have been central characteristics of China's long history. Had this age of exploration continued, however, the Chinese would almost certainly have found their way to America. China could even have overwhelmed Europe with its enormously superior technology and almost unlimited manpower. In 1500, China's population was nearly twice that of Europe, and China was a single united empire, while Europe was, as we have seen, fragmented and at war with itself. One expert calls this the greatest might have been of modern history. If the emperor and the admiral had lived a few more years, if China had not needed to reinforce the Great Wall, we might all be speaking Chinese. But divinity had a different design. That design required that the knowledge of how to build and sail ocean-going ships find its way from China to Europe. But before 1519, there was almost no direct contact between China and Europe. To achieve that design, and a lot more, divinity turned to Islam. If China has been the world's workshop, Islam has been its library. China's gift for materializing an idea is complemented by Islam's gift for preserving ideas, refining them, and spreading them across the world. Reverence for knowledge came directly from the Quran, which calls upon Muslims to study the physical world so that they might appreciate the majesty of God. From the beginning, Islam promoted literacy for the study of the Quran, the direct word of God. Next in importance to the book, as it was called, were the hadith, or traditions, the sayings of Muhammad. Many of these encouraged learning and scholarship. For example, the Prophet said, "The brightness of a learned man compared to that of a mere worshipper is like that of the full moon compared to the stars." The scholar's ink is holier than the martyr's blood. Seek knowledge, even if it be in China, meaning wherever it may be found. Islam was understood to be a continuation of the message God had revealed in earlier ages. Thus, the learning of Jews and Christians, who were also people of the book, or scriptures, was honored and respected. The same principle was broadly applied to all ancient wisdom, and the Muslims thus became the conservators of scholarly heritage of all the territories they assimilated. Greek, Persian, and Hebrew manuscripts and even Sanskrit texts from India were assembled, studied, and translated carefully into Arabic in state-sponsored institutes like the famous House of Wisdom, founded by the Caliph of Baghdad early in the 9th century. As a result, virtually the entire corpus of Greek science, mathematics, and medicine was brought into Arabic, and Arabic became the international language of science. Euclid and Archimedes, Plato and Aristotle, Hippocrates and Galen. Many of their works are only known to us today because they were preserved by the Muslim archivists. Muslim scholars did not merely preserve these texts, they also refined them, corrected them, and expanded on them. Islamic culture at its height was overflowing with the radiance of the Avatar Muhammad, the springtide of creation that brought new energy, broader understanding, and new levels of integration to every aspect of their lives. A standard history of science tells us Islamic civilization was the world leader in virtually every field of science from at least 800 to 1300 AD. We do not really know the true breadth of their achievements because only a fraction of existing Islamic scientific texts have been published. Most remained unstudied and in manuscript. To review their legacy in medicine, chemistry, botany, architecture, metallurgy, philosophy, and so forth is far beyond the scope of these classes. But a brief look at two topics will demonstrate how their achievements contributed to the larger patterns we've been following. You probably know that the Muslims were brilliant mathematicians who gave us, among other things, algebra. The name comes from an Arabic word that can be translated as restoring to balance or reuniting the parts, referring to the process of balancing an algebraic equation. They also gave us the so-called Arabic numerals that we use today, the numbers 1 through 9 and the zero or cipher, which is also an Arabic word. This system was a welcome relief from the clumsiness of Roman numerals. But it is really a system from India that was first adapted by the Islamic mathematicians, then brought to Europe by an Italian traveler in the 13th century. This is a good illustration of the way larger processes of life are designed to operate. This process can be seen clearly in the history of mathematics, which can be outlined in this highly simplified way. Many ancient cultures developed numbers and arithmetic, the basic calculation of quantity. Geometry, the calculation of space, was most fully developed by the Greeks, building on ideas from Egypt, Babylonia, and India. Algebra, the calculation of relationship, was most fully explored by the Muslims, working from largely Greek sources. Calculus, necessary for the study of motion and change, was then developed in Europe in the 17th century by Isaac Newton and others. Parts of each of these mathematical disciplines had evolved in earlier times, but the broader framework needed to support and fully realize the new ideas had not yet emerged into view. Instead, each of these understandings developed apparently separately in a particular cultural matrix, on a particular continent with its unique blends of energy, in a particular epoch of time that favored its expression, and often out of nowhere, with apparent spontaneity and no visible connection to what had gone before. Yet each one was entirely dependent on what had gone before and contributed to what was to come. The missing connections are internal, as the process unfolds at higher levels of life, then waits its opportunity to express itself in the physical realm. Each of these episodes form part of a single stream of thought that is mathematics. And as it has developed, so have all our other understandings of physical science. From the viewpoint of an individual at any turn in the road, mathematical breakthroughs may seem chaotic, random, and haphazard. But from a broader angle of vision, it is a single, beautifully designed pathway through the mind of God. Mathematics, in turn, was indispensable to the development of the physical sciences that are central to the modern age we're now considering. As with mathematics, so it was also with the development of ocean-going ships in Europe. The Arabs were master navigators, partly because of their mastery of astronomy and geography. You may know that Muslims built the first true astronomical observatories and that they made astonishingly accurate star charts and tables of planetary motion in the age before telescopes. Omar Khayyam, who is famous to us as a Sufi poet, was famous to his contemporaries as an astronomer. The Muslims perfected the astrolabe, an instrument that can determine a star's altitude and a ship's latitude. Why were these measurements important? To determine the exact direction of Mecca, toward which every believer was to turn in prayer 5 times a day, and to calculate the precise times for prayer. This information, of course, was also valuable for navigation, for with it you could set a course by the stars when you could not see the land. The skilled Muslim sailors who plied the Indian Ocean are said to have invented the science of steering by the stars. They set down their knowledge in poetic couplets to help them memorize, for example, the altitudes of the pole star at different locations, information about wind directions, reefs, depths, and precise distances between landmarks. All of this information was put into rhyme. One of these nautical guides has over 1,000 verses. They developed other measuring tools too, such as the cross staff and, of course, the compass, which they adapted and improved from the Chinese lodestone. The Muslim navigator said that the new form of the compass, the magnetized needle, had been given to them by the great patron of Muslim sailors, Khizr, who, according to one legend, had guided Alexander the Great over land and sea. During the Crusades, European Christians came into contact with these Muslim techniques and also with their innovations in ship design. Most important of these was the lateen sail, mentioned earlier, that made a ship more maneuverable than the square-rigged European ships. This was ideal in the Mediterranean, but the northern ships, called cogs, with their heavy, well-rounded hull and stern-post rudder, had clear advantages in the stormy seas of the Atlantic coast. Where did they get the stern rudder? The Chinese had developed it centuries before. But as far as we know, it seemed to have evolved independently in Northern Europe in its own time. I say seem to, because that is another way divinity works. Once the forms of life, such as inventions, that are to emerge on the material plane have been created and fully organized in the inner, subtle realms, they can materialize anywhere on the gross plane, providing the necessary conditions for their realization. And so the same invention, like the stern rudder, springs up in different cultures and in different epochs. However, owing to the fundamental unity of life, its initial realization in the gross realm conditions the matter of this realm so as to allow for its duplication in other, apparently unrelated parts of the world with greater ease. In this case, the Chinese initially invented the stern rudder. After they had, so to speak, blazed the trail, anyone, anywhere, with the right frame of mind would be able to follow. And so the Chinese knowledge of how to build and sail ocean-going ships did find its way in this circuitous fashion to Europe. In this creative process, God isn't particular about copyrights. In the same way, no one knows who came up with the idea of combining the Northern European and Muslim styles into a new kind of ship. Some say it evolved in the shipbuilding cities of Genoa or Venice. Others think it might have come from Iberia, where Muslims and Christians had been in contact for a long time. But sometime in the early 1400s, a new ship appeared that was more maneuverable and more rugged. It used both the lateen and the square-rigged sail on 2 and then 3 masts. By the time of Columbus, the full-rigged ship with up to 6 sails had been born. They were called carracks and caravels, and they bore names like the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. This new hybrid craft could hold its course in any but the most adverse wind, and was large enough to undertake voyages of 3,000 miles without a landfall. It had taken a unique blend of the energies of Northern Europe, the Islamic Mediterranean, and Asia, or China, working over hundreds of years to create these little ships and to develop the skills to sail them. Now they were ready. And in 1492, they sailed out into the green sea of darkness to a new world and a new age.